There are some lives the world watches from a distance, and then there are lives the world seems to devour. Michael Jackson belonged to that second category, a person so visible that people stopped seeing him at all. They saw the silhouette, the glove, the hat, the face that changed, the skin that lightened, the whispered rumors, the tabloid headlines, the late-night punchlines. They saw a mystery, but they believed they had already solved it. And that may be the strangest part of all. For decades, millions of people thought Michael Jackson was one of the easiest public figures to explain. He was vain, they said. He was trying to erase himself. He was trying to become someone else. He was bizarre, unnatural, impossible to understand. That verdict hardened so completely that almost nobody stopped to ask the question that matters now. What if the thing everyone felt most certain about was the thing they understood least? Because long before the final rehearsals, long before the trial, long before the autopsy report turned private suffering into public evidence, a story had already been written around Michael Jackson's body. It was a story about appearance, control, race, denial, and reinvention. And once the public accepted that version, everything else began to bend around it. Every change in his face became proof. Every glove, every umbrella, every layer of makeup, every surgical mask, every effort to hide was interpreted as confession. The world was no longer observing a man. It was feeding a theory. What makes this story so unsettling is that the misunderstanding was not limited to gossip columns or cruel comedians. It seeped into ordinary conversation, television coverage, cultural memory, and even into the way many professionals talked about him. Not always openly, not always cruelly, but with the same basic assumption that whatever was happening to Michael Jackson could be explained by vanity first and illness second. In other words, his body became a spectacle before it was treated like evidence. That is the central mystery here. Not whether Michael Jackson suffered, not whether he made mistakes, not whether fame changed him. Of course it did. The real question is much more haunting than that. How did the world become so confident in a story that medicine itself would later complicate? How did a man spend years saying something was happening to his skin, while millions rolled their eyes, only for medical findings after his death to confirm that a major part of what he said had been true? Reuters reported that the autopsy documented vitiligo, describing depigmented patches on his chest, abdomen, face, and arms, the very condition so many had mocked or dismissed while he was alive. Reuters. And that is where the comfortable version of Michael Jackson starts to collapse. For years, public culture treated his appearance as a morality play. It wasn't enough to say he looked different. There had to be a reason that felt emotionally satisfying, a reason people could point to and laugh at, a reason that converted discomfort into certainty. So his changing skin tone became, in the popular imagination, a symbol of self-rejection. His surgeries became evidence of obsession. His isolation became proof of abnormality. Everything fit together too neatly, which should have been the first warning sign. Real suffering is usually messier than that. Real illness rarely arranges itself into a perfect narrative. But simple stories are powerful, especially when they flatter the audience. If Michael Jackson was merely a cautionary tale about excess, then the public never had to face anything more difficult. They never had to confront how little compassion society extends to visible illness. They never had to ask what happens when an autoimmune condition attacks someone whose face is not just recognizable, but globally iconic. They never had to think about what it means to conceal pain when your livelihood depends on appearing supernatural. And for Michael Jackson, appearing supernatural was not optional. From childhood, he had been turned into an image before he had the chance to become an ordinary person. The world first met him as wonder, a child with impossible rhythm, impossible poise, impossible emotional force. By the time he became the biggest entertainer on the planet, he was no longer simply famous. He was symbolic. He represented perfection, escape, fantasy, elegance, precision. He was expected to seem untouched by ordinary human decline. That expectation matters more than people realize, because when illness eventually entered the frame, it did not arrive in private. It arrived under floodlights. Imagine what that means psychologically. Not just to become sick, but to become visibly sick, while the entire planet is trained to measure you against a myth. Not just to worry that your skin is changing, but to know that every camera flash might preserve that change forever. Not just to visit a doctor, but to understand that every medical choice could one day be interpreted as evidence in a trial conducted by strangers. Yet even that was only the surface, because the deeper the record is examined, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. The truth was not simply that Michael Jackson had vitiligo, it was that the condition did not exist in isolation. It collided with trauma, with image culture, with the brutal economics of fame, with physical pain, with sleep problems, with years of living as a body under surveillance. Reuters later noted that evidence from the hearing into his death showed he used large amounts of skin cream to even out the discoloration, while the media that once mocked his explanation had spent years portraying that same explanation as unbelievable. Reuters. That single reversal should have changed more than it did. Because if the public was wrong about that, then what else had been misread? Was the glove just style, or was it also concealment? Were the umbrellas mere eccentricity, or protection from sun sensitivity? Was the makeup just vanity, or armor? Was the secrecy deception, or the exhausted behavior of a person trying to survive inside a body that the world refused to discuss honestly? The answer had been visible all along, but it was buried beneath a louder story people preferred. This is what makes Michael Jackson such a uniquely unsettling figure in cultural history. He was not simply famous enough to be judged. He was famous enough to be diagnosed by the crowd. Everyone became an expert. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone felt licensed to interpret his body, his motives, his identity, his mind. And once mass culture makes that kind of diagnosis, it becomes incredibly hard to undo, even when actual evidence starts to emerge. That is why the title of this story matters so much. The misunderstanding was not just personal, it was historical. It lasted for decades. It survived interviews, denials, hospital records, and finally death itself. It survived because the world found the rumor more satisfying than the medicine. But that was only part of the story, because the moment you look beyond the headlines and into the condition itself, the entire picture becomes more human, more painful, and far more complicated than the caricature people laughed at. The truth turned out to be very different, and once you understand what vitiligo actually does to a person, especially one forced to live inside an image, Michael Jackson's life stops looking like a bizarre performance and starts looking like something else entirely. Part 2. Vitiligo sounds clinical when spoken aloud, almost harmless in its precision, but the experience of it is anything but clinical. It is visible, unpredictable, relentless. It alters the surface by attacking pigment, leaving islands of contrast where continuity used to be. For some patients, it progresses slowly. For others, it expands with cruel speed. It does not ask whether the person affected is private or famous, confident or fragile, ordinary or iconic. It simply changes the skin, and with it, the relationship between a person and the mirror. That matters because Michael Jackson did not develop vitiligo in obscurity. He developed it while being watched by millions. According to a physician at the Vitiligo Clinic and Research Center at UMass Medical School, Jackson publicly said the changes began after the Thriller era, and the physical evidence after his death supported that history. His autopsy noted light and dark pigmented areas, listed vitiligo in his medical history, and recorded depigmenting treatments, including Benoken, an FDA-approved therapy specifically used when patients with vitiligo choose to remove remaining pigment rather than live with a patchwork appearance, UMass Medical School. That one detail changes the emotional geometry of the entire story, because if Jackson used depigmenting treatment, then the public's favorite accusation begins to unravel. He was not simply bleaching himself in the crude, sensational sense people implied. He was treating a condition that had already disrupted the visual unity of his skin. And once you understand that, the dramatic transformation people fixated on no longer looks like a random act of self-erasure. It looks like the end stage of a medical and cosmetic decision made under extraordinary pressure. The world, of course, preferred the uglier explanation. It always does when a famous person becomes difficult to categorize. A skin disorder was too inconvenient, too sympathetic, too human. It interrupted the cleaner myth that Michael Jackson hated himself. So the public kept the myth and discarded the medicine. And with that choice, one of the most visible illnesses of the late 20th century became one of the most mocked. But concealment itself tells a story. People do not hide what causes them no pain. They hide what exposes them. The psychosocial burden of vitiligo is now far better understood than it once was. Modern reviews describe anxiety, shame, hyper-awareness, low self-esteem, social avoidance, depression, and the exhausting daily labor of concealment through clothing or makeup. Some patients report thinking about the condition constantly, even when the patches are covered, because the stress does not end when the skin disappears from view. It follows them into mirrors, relationships, sleep, and public space, PMC. Now place that burden inside Michael Jackson's life. Place it on a man already trapped in a culture of cameras. Place it on someone whose image was not merely public property, but a global product. Place it on a perfectionist performer whose face had become part of his art. Suddenly the makeup, the gloves, the long sleeves, the umbrellas, the evasiveness, the defensive interviews all begin to look less like theatrical weirdness and more like an escalating strategy of control. Not because he wanted to become a symbol, but because he was desperate not to become one, and yet he did. That is part of the tragedy. By trying to conceal the illness, he made the mystery larger. By making the mystery larger, he fed the rumors. By feeding the rumors, he intensified the very scrutiny that likely made concealment feel necessary. It was a perfect trap. The more he hid, the more people accused him of deception. The more people accused him, the more impossible honesty became. Because by the time he addressed vitiligo directly in public, the world had already built an emotional investment in not believing him. Almost nobody noticed how revealing that was. A superstar disclosed a stigmatizing skin condition, and the culture answered not with curiosity, but with suspicion. That reaction says as much about the audience as it does about the celebrity. It exposed how uncomfortable people were with visible difference, especially when it complicated existing racial narratives and tabloid fantasies. It is easier to believe someone is lying than to admit a medical condition can rewrite a famous face in slow motion. And vitiligo was not the only layer shadowing him. Discussion around Michael Jackson's health long included lupus, another autoimmune condition associated with rashes, inflammation, fatigue, and sensitivity to sunlight. Lupus can flare unpredictably and make ordinary exposure to light physically punishing, particularly when the skin is involved. Mayo Clinic. Whether every rumor about Jackson's exact diagnosis was documented with equal clarity is less important than this. The medical context around his appearance was far more complex than the public story ever allowed. That complexity matters because public myths are built by removing it. A rumor thrives when it strips away biological detail, emotional cost, and practical reality. Once those things are removed, all that remains is spectacle. Michael Jackson's changing skin became spectacle. His attempts to even out pigmentation became spectacle. His wigs, hats, makeup, and privacy became spectacle. Even after death, when the autopsy confirmed vitiligo, the larger culture was slow to confront what that confirmation meant. A false certainty had been too profitable for too long. And yet the evidence kept accumulating quietly. Researchers later noted that public interest in vitiligo surged dramatically after Jackson's death, reaching its highest search volume during the week that followed. In other words, many people learned more about the disease only after the man they had mocked was gone. The same study observed that Jackson's case raised awareness, but often too late to educate the public while he was alive, partly because he had spent so much energy concealing the condition in order to survive his own visibility, PMC. There is something devastating in that. The body that was ridiculed became educational only after it could no longer speak. But even this medical layer does not fully solve the mystery. It explains the skin, yes. It explains the creams, the uneven pigmentation, the desperate effort to present one unified face to the world. Yet it does not fully explain the intensity of Michael Jackson's lifelong fragility around appearance, nor his astonishing need for control, nor the sense that his body had become both costume and battleground. For that, you have to go back much earlier. Back before the headlines, back before the surgeries became gossip, back before the gloves and masks and myths, because hidden beneath all of this was something else entirely, a child who never got to be one. Part 3. Michael Jackson's adult life made so little emotional sense to the public because the public kept trying to interpret it from the outside in. But his story only begins to make sense when you move in the opposite direction. From the inside out. From the child, not the icon. From the wound, not the costume. He once said he never had the chance to do the fun things children do. It is one of those sentences that sounds simple until you really hear it. Not, I missed some things. Not, I had to grow up fast. He said he never had the chance. Biography records his repeated longing for childhood, his identification with Peter Pan, and his memory of looking across the street from a recording studio at children playing while he worked instead. The same account also cites his descriptions of physical punishment from his father during rehearsals and the way performance replaced ordinary development, almost before he understood what had been taken from him biography. This matters more than people like to admit, because trauma does not disappear when applause begins. In some cases, applause hides it. It gives suffering rhythm. It gives panic choreography. It teaches a child that love arrives when he performs perfectly and can vanish the moment he fails. If that pattern settles deeply enough, the adult who emerges may become brilliant in public and terrified in private. He may chase control, because control once meant safety. He may freeze time, because time is the thing that stole him from himself in the first place. Suddenly, Michael Jackson's perfectionism does not look like mere eccentricity. It looks like adaptation. His obsession with details, his fear of mirrors, his need to construct fantasy worlds, his uneasy relationship with ordinary adulthood, his comfort on stage and discomfort in crowds, all begin to form a psychological map. Biography quotes him saying that offstage he often felt afraid, while on stage he felt safe. Biography. Think about the sadness of that reversal. The place most people would experience as terrifying, the bright stage before strangers, was where he felt protected. Ordinary life was the place that frightened him. Now add visible illness to that history. Add a changing face to a person whose childhood already taught him that appearance, precision, and audience approval were inseparable from survival. Add global scrutiny to a man whose inner world was organized around performance and vulnerability. The result is not just stress, it is psychic overload. You are no longer simply treating skin, you are managing identity collapse in real time. And then came the fire. In 1984, during the filming of a Pepsi commercial, pyrotechnics ignited too early, and Michael Jackson's hair caught fire. CNN later reported that Jackson himself linked the accident and the reconstructive surgeries that followed to the origin of his dependence on pain medication. Burn specialists explained that scalp burns can be extremely painful, can lead to baldness, can require grafting and debridement, and in some cases can produce prolonged pain if nerves become trapped in scar tissue, CNN. That accident now sits in the historical record, like a clue people noticed, but never fully integrated. Because it did not just injure him. It changed the relationship between his public image and physical pain. It is one thing to be a perfectionist with a traumatic childhood. It is another to suffer a disfiguring injury while already battling a condition that alters pigmentation. Add reconstructive interventions, scalp sensitivity, possible scarring, wigs, hats, cosmetic strategies, and relentless media photography, and a much darker picture begins to emerge. The body that had once been his instrument was becoming a site of constant management. This is where the story becomes especially uncomfortable for anyone who prefers a single explanation. No, Michael Jackson cannot be reduced to one diagnosis. That is precisely the mistake the culture made for years. The truth is more layered, and therefore harder to digest. There was the autoimmune reality of his skin. There was the emotional burden of concealment. There was the trauma of a stolen childhood. There was the physical aftermath of the burn accident. There were the surgeries, some reconstructive, some cosmetic, some likely shaped by the impossible standards surrounding him. There was also fame itself, not as glamour, but as an unnatural environment capable of distorting every coping mechanism a person has. And then there was sleep. One of the most tragic details to emerge after his death was how badly he wanted rest, not sedation as a luxury, but sleep as pursuit. Sleep as obsession, sleep as need. BBC reported that propofol, the drug associated with his death, is a fast-acting hospital sedative intended for tightly controlled medical environments, not ordinary insomnia. Reuters emphasized that the dose and conditions described in the autopsy resembled anesthesia for major surgery, with none of the recommended monitoring present. BBC News Reuters. That fact is often told as shock, but it should also be told as despair. What kind of life leads someone to pursue sleep through hospital-grade sedation in a private bedroom? Vanity does not explain that. Eccentricity does not explain that. Not by itself. You have to imagine the cumulative weight of performance, fear, pain, dependency, public humiliation, and the inability to come down from a nervous system that may have spent decades oscillating between adrenaline and scrutiny. Reuters described testimony suggesting that years of performing for massive crowds made it difficult for him to come down off his own chemistry at night. Reuters. That phrase sounds almost poetic until you realize how catastrophic it is. A body that cannot descend, a mind that cannot shut the lights off after the arena empties. And still, even here, the public instinct was to choose the simplest possible interpretation. Strange man, strange habits, strange death, story complete, except it wasn't complete. It was barely beginning. Because once the medical fragments are placed side by side, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The skin condition was real. The pain was real. The insomnia was real. The childhood wounds were real. The fear around appearance was real. The protective rituals were real. The strange behavior, when pulled out of context, looked bizarre, but when reinserted into the life that produced it, much of it begins to look like adaptation under crushing pressure. Not healthy adaptation, not always wise, but adaptation nonetheless. And that is where the real story begins, because the discovery that changes everything is not one hidden document or one sensational diagnosis. It is the realization that Michael Jackson was misunderstood, precisely because his suffering arrived in forms people found easier to ridicule than recognize. Part 4. The admission did not come in one grand public apology. It came in fragments, in an autopsy report that confirmed what he had said, in physicians explaining depigmenting treatment after years of mockery, in burn experts describing how pain can persist beneath scar tissue, in sleep experts making clear that the drug at the center of his death was never a normal answer to insomnia, in psychological research showing just how devastating visible conditions can be when the world is already staring. Piece by piece, the old caricature began to fail. And what those fragments reveal is both simpler and sadder than the myth. Michael Jackson was not one mystery. He was many realities colliding at once. A child star shaped by fear, an adult performer trapped inside a global symbol, a man with a documented skin disorder trying to preserve a unified face, while the world treated his body like gossip, a person carrying physical pain, emotional fragility, and a catastrophic need for control in an environment designed to monetize collapse. That is what the title means in the deepest sense. Not that every choice he made was medically blameless. Not that every surgery can be reduced to illness. Not that his life can be romantically purified by diagnosis. The point is far more consequential. For decades, too many people interpreted his symptoms as character. They took visible changes and assigned them moral meaning. They looked at concealment and called it deception. They looked at medical treatment and called it vanity. They looked at trauma responses and called them eccentricity. In doing so, they committed one of the oldest errors in human judgment, mistaking suffering for strangeness. Once you see that error, the larger implications become impossible to avoid. History may have misunderstood Michael Jackson, not only as a celebrity, but as a patient whose condition unfolded in public before the culture was willing to discuss it honestly, a patient whose appearance became a battleground for other people's anxieties about race, identity, beauty, fame, and authenticity, a patient so famous that even his illness had to entertain. That should trouble us, because what happened to him did not happen only because he was Michael Jackson. It happened because society is often cruelest when illness becomes visible but remains poorly understood. Vitiligo research today makes clear that stigma can reshape a person's emotional life, producing persistent shame, sadness, self-monitoring, and social withdrawal, PMC. Michael Jackson lived that burden at a scale almost impossible to imagine. Every patch, every attempt to hide, every cosmetic adjustment could become front-page material. The condition was not simply on his skin, it was embedded in his public identity. And then there is the irony that feels almost unbearable. After his death, interest in vitiligo surged to its highest level in years, enough that researchers later noted his association with the condition had become part of its global awareness history, PMC. In other words, the man so many people refused to believe ended up teaching the world about the disease only after the world no longer had to face his pain in real time. That delayed understanding should feel like an indictment, because the public loves revelation when revelation costs nothing. It loves hindsight because hindsight does not require kindness in the present. It is easy to say now that his vitiligo was real. Easy to say now that the creams had a medical purpose. Easy to say now that pain and insomnia were not eccentric stage props. Easy to speak gently when the person in question is no longer alive to hear the gentleness. But the real measure of compassion is whether it arrives before the autopsy. If you step back far enough, Michael Jackson's life begins to look less like the story of a strange celebrity and more like the story of what fame does to vulnerability. It magnifies it, distorts it, commercializes it, and eventually punishes it. The traits that might have remained manageable in a private person become mythic in a public one. A childhood wound becomes a global persona. A medical condition becomes a cultural argument. A sleep problem becomes a fatal headline. The person at the center gets smaller and smaller until the image swallows him whole. And yet something human survives in the record, in the descriptions of him at home with his children, in the music still pulsing with longing, innocence, fear, joy, and impossible precision, in the repeated insistence, however awkwardly delivered, that there was more happening to him than people understood. Reuters noted testimony portraying his home as a place filled with music and children playing, a softer contrast to the monstrous image often projected onto him in the press Reuters. That contrast does not erase controversy, but it does restore dimension, and dimension is often the first step toward truth. So what did doctors finally admit? In effect, even when not all of them used those exact words, they admitted that a body once mocked as evidence of vanity also carried clear evidence of disease. They admitted that treatment had been misread. They admitted that pain and insomnia were not inventions. They admitted, sometimes indirectly, that the public story had been far too simple for the medical reality. And once that admission enters the room, history has to change its tone. Because maybe Michael Jackson was not the symbol people thought he was. Maybe he was not the cartoon of self-hatred, artificiality, and spectacle that culture found so irresistible. Maybe he was something harder to confront, a man unraveling in plain sight, while the world turned his symptoms into entertainment. A genius whose suffering was aestheticized before it was understood. A patient whose body told the truth years before people were ready to hear it. That is why this story lingers. Not because it solves Michael Jackson completely. No honest story ever could. It lingers because it forces a more uncomfortable question onto the present. How many people do we still misunderstand in exactly the same way? How often do we call something bizarre simply because we do not want to investigate its pain? How often do we prefer the rumor because the diagnosis asks too much compassion from us? In the end, Michael Jackson may remain one of the most analyzed public figures in modern history. But analysis is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as mercy. For decades, the world stared at his changing face and thought it was watching a performance. Beyond it may actually have been watching a person disappear inside an illness, a trauma, and a legend no one knew how to separate until it was too late.